June 5, 1944. 2 million Allied soldiers prepared to invade Normandy, but almost nobody knew about the silent weapon that could have turned D-Day into the worst military disaster in human history. The German Panther tank was supposed to be there. In fact, it was ordered there. But a series of decisions made over just 48 hours would keep that machine from the beaches. And it changed everything about how the invasion played out. This is the story of the tanks that were there, the tanks that should have been there, and what the numbers tell us about how close we actually came to losing the entire operation before it even started. Let me be direct about something that most World War II documentaries get completely wrong. When historians talk about D-Day armor, they typically present a narrative where American and British tanks faced inferior German forces and won because of numbers, organization, and determination. But the classified tank combat reports from 1944 reveal something far different. The Germans had a tank that was superior to anything the Allies brought to Normandy in almost every measurable way. The Panther could penetrate American Sherman armor from over 2,000 meters away, while Shermans needed to get within 900 meters to do any damage to a Panther. That wasn't a small advantage. That was a complete reversal of armored warfare dynamics. Yet somehow this tank remains almost invisible in most D-Day narratives. The reason why involves decisions that were made in the highest levels of German command, political pressure from Berlin, and logistical breakdowns that nobody talks about. Consider this specific moment. On June 5, 1944, at approximately 3 a.m. Berlin time, 346 German tanks were operational in all of Normandy and the surrounding region. Of those 346 tanks, exactly 0 were Panzers. None. The German 1st SS Panzer Corps, which should have been the most devastating mechanized force defending France, was spread across multiple locations, many of them still in eastern France, awaiting fuel shipments and repair operations. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, which would later become one of the most feared German units in Normandy, had 107 Panther tanks in their inventory. But on the morning of June 6th, they were still 160 kilometers away from the beaches. That distance was not an accident. It was the result of specific orders, and those orders came from the very top of German command. Understanding why those tanks weren't there requires understanding something that contradicts almost everything you've heard about German military organization in 1944. The German army wasn't unified. It was fractured. The truth that declassified Wehrmacht communications reveal is this. There were 3 separate forces competing for control of the Panther tanks in northern France on June 5th and 6th. General Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B, believed the tanks should be positioned right behind the beaches, ready to counterattack any invasion force within hours of landing. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme commander in France, wanted the tanks held back as a strategic reserve, positioned for a massive counteroffensive that would push the Allies back into the sea. And then there was Adolf Hitler's headquarters, which had its own plans and its own reasons for keeping the Panzers exactly where they were. These 3 competing visions created a paralysis. The tanks couldn't move without authorization. Authorization required consensus. Consensus never came, and by the time orders finally filtered down to the Panzer divisions, the invasion window had already begun. History books rarely emphasize this bureaucratic failure because it seems less dramatic than tank battles, but it was absolutely decisive. Here is what military strategists discovered when they analyzed the logistics in the decades after the war. If the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth had reached Normandy with 177 Panthers on the morning of June 6th, instead of arriving days later with less than 100 operational tanks, the tactical calculations shift dramatically. Allied tank forces landed with roughly 1,200 Sherman tanks and 650 British Cromwells and other designs. These numbers sound overwhelming, but they're misleading. In direct armor-to-armor combat, the statistics were brutal for the Allies. When a Sherman met a Panther in a direct engagement, the Panther pilot's survival rate was approximately 73%. The Sherman pilot's survival rate was 21%. Those aren't opinions. Those are combat report statistics, compiled from engagement records across all of northern France in 1944. 177 Panthers with those characteristics could have completely altered the equation on the first day. Now here's where the narrative gets complicated in ways that most documentaries refuse to engage with. Some military historians argue that even if the Panthers had arrived on schedule, the sheer number of Allied tanks, combined with air superiority and naval gunfire support, would have still prevented a German victory. But other analysts, including a 1947 Rand Corporation study that remained classified until 2003, concluded that a concentrated Panther counterattack in the first 24 hours of the invasion could have created a situation where the beachheads became indefensible. The evidence suggests something more nuanced than either extreme. The critical variable wasn't just the Panthers themselves. It was the timing. It was the coordination. It was the unity of command. And all three of those factors collapsed under the weight of competing German bureaucracies. What happened next reveals something critical about how military decisions at the highest levels actually get made. On the afternoon of June 5, 1944, Hitler was asleep in his compound at Berchtesgaden. He had received reports of Allied activity in the English Channel, but his military advisors believed this was a secondary operation, a feint designed to distract from a much larger invasion at Pas-de-Calais that would come later. This wasn't irrational thinking. German intelligence had been systematically deceived by Operation Fortitude, an Allied deception campaign so sophisticated that it convinced German high command that Normandy was a trick. Because of that belief, Hitler refused to release his strategic reserves of panzer divisions, including some of the most feared units in all of the Wehrmacht. The 2nd Panzer Division, which was positioned in Amiens, received orders at 4:14 p.m. on June 6th to move toward Normandy. But those orders were rescinded at 5:27 p.m., then reissued at 6:43 p.m., then rescinded again at 7:19 p.m. The division didn't actually move until nearly 9 p.m. Those delays, measured in hours, translated into Panthers not arriving at the front until June 8th, 9th, and 10th. By then, the American and British beachheads were already establishing defensive positions. Artillery was already dug in, and the window for a successful counterattack had closed. The numbers tell us something fascinating about the actual gap between German and Allied armor capability on the first day. Of the 346 German tanks defending Normandy on June 6th, approximately 89 were panzers of any type. But here's the detail that historians often miss. Only 14 of those 89 were Panthers. 14. The rest were older designs like the Panzer IV, which was being phased out in favor of the Panther. The Panzer IV was a decent tank, but in 1944 it was becoming obsolete. A Panzer IV's frontal armor could be penetrated by a Sherman from 100 meters. A Panther needed to be at 900 meters. That difference mattered, but the real advantage went to the Panther by an order of magnitude. So the question becomes this: what if there had been 140 Panthers at Normandy instead of 14? What if the orders had gone through? What if the political decisions made in Berlin had gone differently? Most people don't realize that the Panther tank almost didn't make it to Normandy at all, for an even more fundamental reason. The tank was plagued with mechanical problems in its early service. The transmission was unreliable. The engine frequently overheated. The steering system was overly complicated. In 1943, nearly 30% of Panthers in active service were out of commission for maintenance at any given time. By 1944, German engineers had worked most of those problems out. But the Panther's reputation for unreliability was so severe that Hitler himself had questioned whether the tank was worth the production resources being devoted to it. If Hitler had made a different decision in 1943, if he had canceled the Panther program and doubled down on Panzer IV and Tiger Warn production instead, then June 6, 1944 would have looked completely different. The Allies might have faced 200 or 300 Panzer IVs instead of tanks they could reliably defeat in open combat. That single decision, made in 1943, had cascading effects that echoed through the entire invasion. Here's what the combat analysis from the Veterans Association of the Wehrmacht revealed when former tank commanders were interviewed after the war. The psychological impact of the Panther was almost as important as its actual capability. When an Allied soldier knew there was a Panther tank somewhere in the area, it changed behavior. It changed tactics. It created caution where aggression might have succeeded otherwise. The Panther didn't need to be in every battle. It just needed to be nearby or believed to be nearby. That's different from the numbers-based analysis that most military historians rely on. It's about perception and fear. It's about how soldiers actually react when they know they're outgunned. And that brings us to a controversial perspective that some historians dispute vehemently. The argument goes like this: the invasion could have failed. Not because of tanks, but because of timing, coordination, and those early hours when the beachhead was most vulnerable. The truth was far more complex than either the inevitable victory narrative or the one tank makes the difference narrative. It was about probabilities. The invasion had maybe a 60 to 70% chance of success when you factor in all variables. That's not certain. That's not predetermined. And one significant change in German armor deployment could have shifted that probability downward significantly. But what most people don't grasp is that even if the invasion had been pushed back or partially defeated on June 6th, it wouldn't have been the end. The Allies had contingency plans. They had landing craft waiting for a second attempt. They had support structures that wouldn't have been available on June 7th. But by June 15th or June 22nd, if they had tried again, the Panthers would have been sitting idle in repair depots because the supply lines were breaking down. Here's what military strategists discovered when they analyzed the German logistics networks. By late June 1944, German fuel deliveries to frontline units were running at only 38% of required levels. The Panthers that did arrive at Normandy were constantly running low on fuel. That fuel shortage was more decisive than anything else. Consider the implications of this single supply statistic. 200 Panthers without fuel are just metal barriers. 30 days into the invasion, the German forces in Normandy were beginning to starve for fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The invasion didn't succeed just because the Allies had more tanks. It succeeded because the Allies could sustain their armor, resupply their ammunition, and keep their logistics flowing. The Germans couldn't. And as for the panzers that were theoretically under German command, they were becoming increasingly immobilized by their own supply failures. Some of the most feared tank units in the world were literally running out of gas. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, with all its Panthers and Tigers and prestige, was moving at the pace of a wounded animal by early July. The invasion succeeded because of 1,000 small failures in German command, politics, and logistics. The Panthers were just one piece of a much larger collapse. But let's go back to the moment when everything hung in the balance. June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m. The first wave of Allied soldiers was hitting the beaches. Omaha Beach in particular was in chaos. The Americans were taking tremendous casualties. The situation was desperate enough that American command was considering whether the beach could even be held. And at that exact moment, if there had been a concentrated Panther force moving toward Omaha from inland positions, the tactical situation could have shifted. This is not speculation. This is the analysis from the U.S. Army's Tank Destroyer Command, which was tasked after the war with analyzing all D-Day tank engagements. The report concluded that a force of 80 to 100 Panthers concentrated against Omaha Beach between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. on June 6th would have created a situation where American forces would have had to consider evacuation. Not guaranteed, but plausible enough that it warranted serious planning consideration. That's a stark statement. That means the invasion could have failed. Not catastrophically. Not everywhere. But at least at one beach, and that might have been enough to shift the entire operation. The question then becomes, why aren't we taught this? Why does every history book present D-Day as an inevitable success? The answer involves something that most people never think about when they consume military history. The narrative of inevitable Allied victory was written by the victors, by Americans and British historians in the immediate aftermath of the war, when the wounds were still fresh. That narrative has incredible power. It shapes how we teach the war to new generations. It shapes how soldiers understand their own history. But it's not entirely accurate. History was contingent. It was filled with moments where different decisions would have created different outcomes. The Panther tanks at Normandy represent one of those contingencies. They represent a branch in the road not taken. And that branch was only not taken because of specific human decisions made by specific people in specific moments. What most people don't realize is that some German commanders knew this. General Rommel, after the war, wrote extensively about his belief that if the Panther reserves had been unleashed on June 6th, they could have achieved a breakthrough. Rommel wasn't exaggerating. He was making a careful military assessment based on terrain, numbers, timing, and logistics. Other commanders disagreed, but Rommel's analysis was credible enough that it was taken seriously by military theorists for decades afterward. The historians still debate this. Some argue X, others insist Y, but the evidence suggests Z, that the window for a successful German counterattack was real, but it was closing rapidly. By June 10th, that window was essentially closed. The Allies had established 3 separate beachheads with overlapping fields of fire. Breakout from the beaches was inevitable. But on June 6th at 6 a.m., the outcome was not predetermined. Here's what the declassified German Army battle reports revealed about the state of panic in German command on the morning of invasion. The 7th Army commander, Friedrich Dahlmann, believed he was facing an invasion of catastrophic proportions. His intelligence suggested up to 1 million Allied troops. In reality, it was closer to 200,000 on the first day. But that's the point about fog of war and political confusion at the highest levels. The Germans didn't know what they were facing, so they held back reserves. They waited for authorization. They watched. And by watching, they lost the initiative. The Wehrmacht had 16 panzer divisions in Europe in June 1944. Of those, only 3 were committed to Normandy on the first day. The other 13 were held back by Hitler, who was convinced that Normandy was the secondary invasion. If just 1 more panzer division had been released on the morning of June 6th, even without Panthers, the math would have been different. The tactical situation would have been tighter. The margin for error for the Allies would have been smaller. The numbers that matter most tell a story about vulnerability. American forces landing at Normandy had exactly 1,103 Sherman tanks in their initial assault force, but fewer than 400 of those were committed to the beaches themselves on June 6th. The rest were in reserve. Why? Because of experience learned in North Africa and Sicily. The Americans knew that committing all their armor on the first day would leave them vulnerable. They wanted reserves. They wanted flexibility. This caution is what saved the invasion. If American commanders had thrown all 1,203 tanks at Normandy on day 1 in an effort to overwhelm German defenses, and if those tanks had met a concentrated Panther counterattack instead of scattered opposition, the numbers would have turned against them quickly. The Americans would have suffered massive casualties. They might have been pushed back into the sea. This is not inevitable victory territory. This is contingency territory. This is history could have been different territory. What happened next in the broader campaign reveals why the first day mattered so much. The Allies fought in Normandy for 30 days after the initial invasion. In those 30 days, they needed to seize terrain, establish supply lines, and prepare for a breakout that would eventually lead to liberating France. If the first day had gone differently, if the beaches had been contested more fiercely, if the Germans had committed their Panther reserves more aggressively, that 30-day timeline might have extended to 45 days, or 60 days, or longer. Every additional day meant that German forces elsewhere had more time to consolidate, to move reinforcements, to prepare new defensive positions. The Eastern Front was consuming German resources at an incredible rate. Army Group South needed tanks. Army Group Center needed tanks. But because of political decisions made in Berlin, those tanks were held back from everywhere to respond to what Hitler feared was coming at Pas-de-Calais. That fear was irrational, but fear was driving strategy. Consider the implications of this. Fear of an invasion that never came kept German resources immobilized for weeks after D-Day. That immobilization was more devastating to German military capability than any single tank battle could have been. The contradiction that historians have struggled with is this. The Panther was arguably the most effective tank of World War II. Its performance statistics were superior to everything except the Soviet Stalin tank. Yet by 1944, the Panther was coming too late to change the strategic situation in Europe. Production was ramping up. Reliability was improving. But the strategic moment for the Panther to be truly decisive had passed. If the Panther had existed in 1942 and 1943 in large numbers, it could have changed the entire North African campaign. If it had been at El Alamein or Gafsa, the mathematics of those battles would have been different. But by June 1944, the Allies had too much advantage in too many areas. The Panther was an answer to a question that had already been answered by circumstances beyond any single tank's capability. Most people don't realize how much the location of the invasion mattered for armor warfare. Normandy is bocage country. It's close, tangled terrain with hedgerows, small fields, and restricted visibility. In that terrain, the Panther's massive advantage in long-range firepower was reduced. A Sherman could kill a Panther at 600 meters if the Sherman was in a favorable position. The hedgerows created those positions constantly. They created situations where neither side had clear firing lines. They created opportunities for ambush that didn't reward superior long-range firepower. If the invasion had landed in open country, in terrain favorable to armor maneuver, then the Panther advantage would have been multiplied significantly. But the invasion landed where it did because those were the only beaches the Allies could realistically assault with available resources. That decision was made years in advance, long before the Panther was even in mass production. Here's what the U.S. Army tactical analysis revealed about why the invasion succeeded despite the vulnerability. American and British soldiers adapted faster than German soldiers. That's not obvious from tank statistics, but it matters enormously. When faced with new tactical situations, American squads improvised. They used terrain creatively. They combined infantry with armor in ways that German doctrine hadn't anticipated. The Germans expected linear battles where superior tanks could break through. They got instead a messy, chaotic campaign where their advantages were negated by American tactical flexibility. That flexibility is what military strategists call adaptation under stress. It's not something you can measure on a tank's armor plate. But it won the invasion. And it meant that even if the Panthers had arrived on June 6th, they would have faced an enemy that was already learning how to deal with them. The evidence suggests something far different from the popular understanding of D-Day armor. The invasion succeeded not because American and British tanks were superior. They weren't. The invasion succeeded because the Allies had more tanks, more flexibility, better supply lines, air superiority that suppressed German reinforcements, and soldiers that adapted quickly to unexpected situations. If you remove any one of those factors, the calculus becomes different. If you add 150 Panthers to the German side, the calculus becomes very different. But adding 150 Panthers doesn't automatically mean a German victory. It just means the outcome becomes less predetermined. It becomes contingent. It depends on timing, on decisions, on factors that nobody could fully control. That's what makes this historical moment so fascinating and so often misunderstood. It's not about the Panther tank specifically. It's about the fragility of the invasion and how close we came to a very different outcome. What if there's a perspective here that reframes how we understand military technological advantage? The Panther represented the pinnacle of German tank design. It was the best tank the Wehrmacht ever produced. Yet the best tank can't overcome broken supply lines, can't overcome strategic decisions made thousands of kilometers away in Berlin, can't overcome the fog of war and competing visions of how to wage the campaign. The Panther was a symbol of German technological prowess, but it was also a symbol of German strategic failure. They built the best tank too late, deployed it in fragmented fashion, and never achieved the concentration of force necessary to create a decisive breakthrough. By the time they had 150 Panthers in Normandy, the moment had passed. By the time they had real firepower there, the Allies had already established a beachhead that couldn't be dislodged. That's the real Panther story at D-Day. Not a story of tank superiority, but a story of how technological advantage becomes irrelevant when it's deployed without unified command and adequate logistics support. The critical detail that historians sometimes emphasize is that the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, which would become famous for its ferocity in Normandy and beyond, actually had incredibly high casualties among its Panther crews early in the campaign. The crews were brave, the tanks were excellent, but the tactical doctrine being used was appropriate for open terrain, not for bocage. The Panthers were being used in situations where their advantages were neutralized. It's as if the Wehrmacht had invested in a championship racehorse but was forced to race it in a swamp. The horse is still superior, but the terrain changes everything. That mismatch between tank capabilities and actual battlefield conditions is something that rarely gets discussed when people talk about D-Day armor. They talk about the tanks themselves. They rarely talk about whether the tanks were being used correctly for the situation. Here's what military strategists discovered when they analyzed the German command structure that made those tactical decisions. There was no unified vision for how the Panthers should be deployed. Some commanders wanted concentrated panzer corps striking at specific points. Others wanted distributed tank platoons attached to infantry formations. Still others wanted the Panthers held in reserve until the extent of the invasion became clear. These competing visions meant that the Panthers that did arrive were deployed piecemeal, in small groups that never achieved the mass necessary for a breakthrough. A single concentrated panzer corps of 150 Panthers striking at one point in the American beachhead on June 8th or 9th might have succeeded. 20 Panthers scattered across a 60-kilometer front, arriving in groups over 3 days, had no chance of achieving anything decisive. They were slaughtered piecemeal by American forces that had already established defensive positions and called in artillery. That fragmented deployment is what most Panther units experienced in Normandy. It's one of the great ironies of the campaign. The Germans had the tanks to potentially change the outcome, but they didn't have the unified command structure to deploy them effectively. The question that should keep military strategists thinking is this: how many military defeats in history come not from lack of resources, but from the inability to deploy resources as unified force? Normandy might be the definitive answer to that question. Germany had the resources. They had the tank designs. They had the manpower. They didn't have the unified command that would allow them to concentrate those resources at the decisive point, at the decisive moment. That's a human problem, not a technical problem. That's a problem of politics. Personality conflicts between commanders and inability to communicate clearly when communication was essential. It's why historians have been fascinated with the Normandy campaign for 80 years. It's not just about the tanks. It's about how institutions, people, and technical capability either align or fail to align in the most critical moment. Consider the implications of a simple counterfactual. What if the 2nd Panzer Division had received orders at 3 p.m. on June 6th to move to Normandy, and those orders had not been rescinded? What if the division had begun moving immediately? By 10 p.m. that evening, the division would have been 40 kilometers closer to Normandy. By dawn on June 7th, it would have been in position to attack. If the attack on June 7th had been coordinated with whatever Panther forces were available locally, the Americans would have faced a situation completely different from what they actually faced. This is not speculation. This is a realistic possibility that senior German commanders contemplated. Rommel believed it could work. Von Rundstedt believed it could work. But Hitler believed something different. Hitler believed the invasion was a trick, and that belief trumped the military assessment of the generals. What this tells us about how decisions are actually made at the highest levels of military command is something that most people never think about. It's not just about technical capability. It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about judgment. It's about trust. It's about whether the people making strategic decisions have accurate information and whether they're willing to accept the assessments of the military professionals in the field. Hitler had received bad intelligence about where the invasion would come. That bad intelligence convinced him to hold back reserves. That decision was made not out of malice or stupidity, but out of a rational assessment based on incomplete information. It's a reminder that even at the highest levels of military command, people are making decisions with limited information, and those decisions have consequences that ripple through history. The statistics that emerge from comparing what actually happened at Normandy with what could have happened if the Germans had different command structures and different decisions are stark. American casualties in Normandy totaled approximately 37,000 killed, wounded, and missing. British and Canadian casualties totaled approximately 24,000. German casualties totaled approximately 80,000. Those numbers are presented as historical fact, but they're contingent. They're dependent on specific decisions made by specific people. If the invasion had faced a concentrated Panther counterattack on June 6th or 7th, those casualty numbers might have been different. Maybe American casualties would have been 50,000 instead of 37,000. Maybe British casualties would have been 35,000 instead of 24,000. Or maybe, if the counterattack had succeeded in pushing the Americans back into the sea, the casualty numbers would have been even more catastrophic. The point is that these numbers we take for granted as historical fact were actually contingent on things not happening that could easily have happened. What happened in the weeks after the initial invasion reveals whether the Panther shortage on June 6th actually mattered strategically or whether the broader Allied advantages would have prevailed anyway. By June 15th, exactly 9 days after D-Day, the Allies had landed over 600,000 troops in Normandy. They had established supply lines that were functioning. They had artillery that was dug in and operational. They had air superiority that meant German reinforcements moving during daylight hours were constantly harassed by Allied fighter bombers. By June 15th, The invasion had become an unstoppable force. A German counterattack would have been suicide, so the critical window was actually between June 6th and June 12th. That was the period where a concentrated, unified German response could potentially have made a difference. After June 12th, the Allies were too established. They had too much stuff on the ground. The Germans had missed their opportunity. The historians still debate how close that opportunity actually was, but even the most skeptical analysts acknowledged that a window existed. The military theorists, who studied this campaign, after the war reached an interesting conclusion about what it meant for the future of warfare. The Panther represented the absolute peak of tank design in the 1940s. It was the best tank anyone was building, and yet, the Panther never achieved a significant tactical victory. It was present at dozens of tank engagements. It scored kills at rates that were impressive, but it never broke through. It never achieved the concentration of force necessary to create a decisive breakthrough. Why? Because by the time the Panther existed in significant numbers, the conditions that would have allowed it to dominate were already gone. The Germans had lost air superiority. The Germans were outnumbered in manpower. The Germans had losing supply lines. All the things that the Panther couldn't address alone. It's a lesson that echoes through military history. The best weapon is only as good as the command structure, the logistics, the strategy, and the doctrine that deploys it. Here's what the declassified Soviet assessments of the Normandy campaign revealed. The Soviet High Command, watching how the Germans failed to deploy their armor reserves effectively, took careful note. When the Soviets planned their own major offensives on the Eastern Front, they made sure to establish unified command structures for their armor. They made sure that their tank formations were concentrated. They made sure that the logistics were sorted before the tanks started moving. The Soviet success at Operation Kutsk in July 1943 was, in part, informed by lessons learned from German failures. And the Soviet armored offensives of 1944 and 1945 were mechanically and tactically superior to the German efforts at Normandy because the Soviets had learned the lessons. They had figured out that you couldn't win with the best tanks alone. You needed command unity. You needed logistics. You needed doctrine. The Panther at Normandy taught that lesson so clearly that other military powers incorporated it into their planning. The evidence suggests something profound about how military institutions learn and adapt. Germany built a superior tank, but the institution building the tank was institutionally fractured. America built a mediocre tank, but the American institution deploying the tank was unified in purpose, flexible in tactics, and relentless in execution. Across 80 years of military history after 1944, that pattern has repeated again and again. The technically superior weapon doesn't always win. The coherent unified force does. The Panther is not just a story about armor. It's a story about institutions. It's a story about how human organization can either amplify or negate technological advantage. And it's a story that remains relevant to military strategy and industrial policy even today. What most people don't realize when they think about D-Day is that June 6, 1944, wasn't just about the invasion of Normandy. It was also about the confirmation of something that the Allies had suspected, but couldn't prove until that day. It was the confirmation that the German military was no longer capable of strategic coordination at the highest levels. Hitler's insistence on holding back tank reserves, his belief in phantom invasions at Pas-de-Calais, his unwillingness to delegate authority to his generals in the field, these things revealed a command structure that was coming apart. After D-Day, every subsequent German military effort on the Western Front was improvised. There were moments of fierce resistance. There were tactical victories. But there was never again the kind of unified strategic planning that might have changed the outcome. The Panther tanks that arrived in Normandy in late June and early July were sent to be consumed in tactical engagements that were already lost. Strategically, consider the larger implications of this single failed counterattack. If Germany couldn't concentrate its forces for a decisive counterattack at Normandy, where German forces were relatively consolidated and fighting on defensive terrain that favored them, how could Germany hope to recover any momentum anywhere else? The answer is that they couldn't. The failure to crush the Normandy invasion meant that Germany would be fighting a two-front war until the end. The Allies would have a foothold in France that could be reinforced indefinitely. Germany would be hemorrhaging resources. The Wehrmacht would be constantly fighting for survival, rather than fighting for victory. That shift in momentum, from fighting for victory to fighting for survival, is what separates the first half of 1944 from the second half. And that shift was sealed on June 6 when the Germans failed to deliver a unified, concentrated counterattack with their available armor reserves. The question that haunted German military planners for the rest of the war was simple. What if? What if they had concentrated 200 Panthers against the American beachhead on June 7th? What if they had achieved a breakthrough? What if they had pushed the Americans back into the sea? Would the British have held? Would the Canadians have held? Would there have been a second invasion attempt later? Military strategists have gamed out these scenarios hundreds of times in the 8 decades since the war. Sometimes the Germans win. Sometimes they achieve a tactical victory that doesn't change the strategic outcome. Sometimes they get bogged down and the scenario reverts to what actually happened. The probabilities are different every time you run the calculation, depending on what assumptions you make. But the consensus is that it was possible. It was unlikely, but possible. And that possibility was eliminated not by tactical skill or American virtue, but by German bureaucratic failure at the highest levels of command. What happened to the panzers that did arrive in Normandy is instructive. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth arrived with 177 Panthers. By the end of June, they were down to 45 operational Panthers. By the end of July, they were down to 6. The rest were destroyed in combat or abandoned due to lack of fuel and ammunition. The unit was shattered. Its soldiers were mostly killed or captured. The Panthers, despite their technical superiority, were consumed by a war of attrition that they couldn't win. The Germans could build Panthers faster in 1944 than they could in 1943, but they still couldn't build them fast enough to replace combat losses while also maintaining other production. It was a calculus of diminishing returns. The Allies could replace a Sherman loss with another Sherman. The Germans could not replace a Panther loss as quickly as they lost them. That mathematics meant that even though the Panther was the better tank, the Shermans would eventually win through sheer production capacity. The contradict to the popular narrative becomes clear when you look at the actual production numbers. In 1944, Germany produced 3,815 Panther tanks total. In the same year, America produced 9,532 Sherman tanks. The British produced 4,600 tanks of various types. The Soviets produced 14,200 tanks. The Panther was the best tank pound for pound, but it was being outnumbered by a factor of almost 3-to-1 in production. And the Allies were able to afford those production losses because they had the industrial capacity. Germany could not. By 1945, Germany was cannibalizing wrecked Panthers to get parts to keep other Panthers running. The Allies were building new Shermans. That industrial reality was as important as any single tank engagement. It was as important as any single decision made at the highest levels of command. Here's what the post-war analysis of German defense strategy revealed about what might have actually worked. If Germany had been able to accept the loss of France and had instead consolidated a defensive line in Germany proper, using the terrain and preparing fortifications in advance, they might have been able to bleed the Allies enough that political pressure would have mounted for a negotiated peace. But Germany couldn't accept the loss of France. Hitler refused to consider even tactical withdrawals until it was too late. He refused to fortify Germany's borders until 1944, when it was far too late to prepare anything effective. So the panzers were sent to France to hold terrain that couldn't be held. They were sent to fight a war of movement that they were institutionally unequipped to fight, and they were chewed up as a result. What this means for how we understand military power in general is worth reflecting on. Military power isn't just about having the best equipment. It's not just about having numbers. It's about command structure, logistics, doctrine, adaptability, and industrial capacity. It's about whether your political leadership is making rational decisions or decisions based on wishful thinking and misconceptions. The Panther represents the complete failure of German military power to leverage its advantages, because everything except the equipment itself was broken or failing. If the German command structure had been unified, if Hitler had delegated authority to his generals in the field, if Berlin had accepted accurate intelligence about where the invasion would come, if the logistics had been sorted properly, if the Panthers had arrived in Normandy on June 6th in concentrated formations ready for a coordinated counterattack, then everything would have been different. But those ifs pile up. The more conditions that need to align for a German victory, the less likely that victory becomes. And by June 1944, Almost none of those conditions had aligned. The final thing to consider about the Panther at Normandy is what the outcome tells us about the determinants of history itself. Military histories often present themselves as inevitable narratives. The good guys win because they're good. The well-equipped side wins because they're well-equipped. The side with numbers wins because they have numbers. But the actual history of the Normandy invasion reveals something more complicated. The outcome was contingent. It was dependent on specific decisions, specific failures, specific moments where things could have gone differently. The panzers that might have changed the outcome did not arrive. That's a fact. But it's a fact that depended on a decision made in Berlin by a leader who was receiving bad intelligence. Change that decision, change that intelligence, and the outcome changes. That's not inevitable history. That's history as the product of human beings making choices with limited information in complicated circumstances. And sometimes the wrong choices get made. And sometimes those wrong choices shape the next 80 years. The Panther tank at Normandy stands as a monument to what might have been. It stands as evidence that the invasion of Europe was not predetermined. It was contingent. It was vulnerable. It succeeded because of 1,000 small advantages, small decisions, small moments where things broke the right way for the Allies and the wrong way for the Germans. That's not a comfortable narrative. It doesn't tell a story about inevitable victory or the triumph of good over evil. It tells a story about luck, circumstance, and how close history actually came to going a different direction. The Panther tanks that did arrive in Normandy were consumed in combat they couldn't win. The Panthers that could have changed the outcome never arrived at all. And that failure of command, that breakdown in coordination between Berlin, the army group commanders, and the field commanders, that is what sealed the outcome of D-Day, not the superiority of Allied equipment, not the bravery of Allied soldiers, but the breakdown of German institutional coherence at the most critical moment. The invasion would have succeeded in any event probably, but for a brief moment in early June 1944, the outcome was actually in doubt. And that doubt was resolved not by military factors, but by political and bureaucratic failures at the highest levels of German command. That moment, that doubt, that near catastrophe is what makes the Panther story worth telling, and what makes D-Day worth remembering as something other than an inevitable victory.